The first time I saw her, the night was heavy with clouds, and the smell of rain was caught in the air. My lantern light stretched just far enough across the yard to catch the outline of a figure moving slow, almost dragging itself toward the barn. Out here on the edge of town where folks didn't wander unless they had a reason, it was rare to see a stranger. Yet there she was, clutching her shawl close against the chill, her boots scuffing over the dirt as if every step cost her something. I didn't call out right away. Instead, I stood on the porch of my farmhouse, the wood groaning beneath my weight, and watched her cross into the barn as though it were hers by right. Something in the way she moved, tired but determined, made me hold my tongue. I knew the dangers of strangers, especially in these wild country lands where law was thin and mercy thinner, but there was a pull in me that said let her be, at least for tonight. The barn door gave its usual low moan, a sound I'd grown used to in my years of tending cattle and horses. But that night it seemed louder, almost like it was protesting against her arrival. I set down the lantern on the porch rail and kept my eyes fixed on the barn until darkness swallowed it whole. The storm broke just then, fat drops falling hard against the roof, and I reckoned if she'd meant trouble, she'd have shown it by now. When morning came, I stepped outside expecting to find my barn empty, or maybe discover a worn traveler curled against a pile of hay, grateful for shelter. Instead, I found her sitting upright on the stall gate, as if she'd been waiting for me all along. The dawn light painted her face in a pale glow, and I could see now what the darkness had hidden. Her eyes carried a weariness far older than she seemed, and her hands were marked with calluses that spoke of hard living. She didn't flinch when I approached, nor did she try to explain herself. She only said, "I needed a place out of the storm. I'll be gone before noon." Her voice was low, not shy, but careful, like every word had to earn its way past her lips. I should have told her to leave, reminded her that this was my land, my barn, and no place for a stranger. But I didn't. Something about her felt like unfinished business waiting to be known. And deep down I sensed that turning her away would change more than just the course of her night, it might change the course of mine. The barn smelled of hay and leather, the horses shifting restlessly as if they, too, were curious about the stranger in their midst. She ran her hand along the railing, eyes drifting over the animals with a kind of gentle knowing, and I realized she wasn't new to such places. Whoever she was, she had worked around barns before. That thought made me wonder where she came from, and why she had ended up here of all places. Alone on a stormy night in the middle of nowhere. Breakfast sat untouched on the table back in the farmhouse as the morning wore on. I kept finding excuses to circle back to the barn, checking on the horses, checking the feed, though what I was really checking on was her. Each time, she remained calm, unhurried, like she had no intention of rushing anywhere. It was as if the storm had followed her in spirit, leaving behind a silence thick with questions. By midday, the clouds had cleared, but she hadn't moved on. Instead, she stood near the open loft window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You live alone?" she said softly when I finally asked her name. She didn't answer with words, only a faint smile that carried more mystery than any reply. That smile unsettled me, made me feel both seen and hidden at once. I learned little about her that day, except that she was stubborn. She refused food at first, only taking a sip of water after I insisted. She spoke sparingly, leaving me to piece together scraps of meaning from her silences, and yet for reasons I couldn't name, I didn't mind her presence. There was a weight to her company, the kind that filled empty spaces I hadn't noticed in years of solitude. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I told myself she would leave with the dusk. Travelers always did. They drifted in when the road was rough, then vanished as soon as their strength returned. I watched her settle back into the hayloft, her figure blending with the shadows, and I almost convinced myself that by morning she'd be gone. But the night stretched long, and I woke more than once, hearing the faint creak of floorboards that weren't in the farmhouse. The barn had its own life, its own voice, but that night it spoke differently. I could swear I heard footsteps where there should have been none, whispers of movement carried through the still air. At dawn, when I rose and stepped into the yard, the barn door stood open wider than I'd left it.
Right.
Yet what I found was not an empty barn. The hay was unsettled, her shawl laid neatly across the stall, as if folded by careful hands. And then I saw her no longer in the loft, no longer keeping her distance among the horses and tools, but there in my bed inside the farmhouse, as though she belonged. For a long moment, I stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the comfort of routine and the pull of something unexplainable. She was there, resting peacefully beneath the quilt my mother had sewn, her breathing even and steady as if she had always been part of this place. Questions crowded my mind. Who was she, and what past was she running from? Why had she chosen my barn, my land, my life to step into? Most of all, what would it mean now that she had crossed the threshold from stranger to something far more complicated? The day was just beginning, but I already knew nothing would be the same after that morning. The storm had passed, yet I felt one brewing inside the quiet walls of my farmhouse, a storm tied not to the weather, but to the arrival of the woman who had come in with the night. And as I stood there, listening to the sound of her steady breathing, I realized that whatever story was about to unfold, I had no way of turning it back. I had entered my world without asking, and I had let her stay. By the time the sun rose higher, I could no longer tell if I was the one offering her shelter or if I was the one being pulled into her unknown. That was the moment I understood. Her presence carried with it both danger and promise, and the truth of why she was here had only just begun to reveal itself. The morning she lay in my bed, the house felt different. The air was heavy, as though it carried a secret I wasn't yet meant to know. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, caught between the need to wake her and the quiet pull to leave her be. My mother's quilt was draped over her shoulders, the same quilt that had warmed me through winters when the fire went out, and something about that unsettled me. It wasn't just a stranger sleeping in my house, it was a stranger wrapped up in pieces of my life. I stepped back into the kitchen, my boots soft against the worn boards, and set the kettle on. The scrape of metal against the stove broke the silence, and for a moment, I wondered if the sound would rouse her. But no, the house stayed quiet, except for the steady creak of the roof beams. I busied myself with the small things, grinding beans, pulling wood for the fire. Anything to distract from the fact that an unknown woman was resting in the very heart of my home. The farm was used to my solitude. For years it had been just me, the cattle, the horses, and the endless work that stretched from dawn to dusk. Some days I welcomed it. Silence can be a balm when you've lived through too much noise, too much loss. Other days, though, the quiet pressed against me until I thought it might break me clean in two. I never told anyone that part, not the neighbors in town, not the drifter I sometimes hired for fence work. Out here, a man was supposed to be steady, not troubled by loneliness. I thought of that as I carried a pail of water in from the pump, the chill biting through the handle. She hadn't stirred. I half expected her to be gone when I looked again, as if she'd vanished like a dream carried away with the night. But she was still there, hair spilled across the pillow, the faint rise and fall of her breath steady as river water. It was strange how quickly the mind adjusts. A day ago, the idea of someone stepping into my barn uninvited would have felt like a trespass. Now, I caught myself worrying she might leave before I understood why she had come. When she finally opened her eyes, the morning had stretched long past its usual rhythm. The cattle were restless in the fields, the sun climbing higher, and still I found myself drawn back to that small bedroom door. She looked around slowly, her gaze taking in the wooden beams, the narrow window, the chair in the corner where I'd sat more nights than I cared to count. When her eyes met mine, there was no fear in them. Never apology, either just a calm acknowledgement, like she'd expected me to be there all along. "No, you didn't send me away," she said, her voice even softer than the night before. "I reckon the storm had more say in that than I did," I answered, though we both knew the storm had passed hours ago. She sat up, pulling the quilt tighter, her shoulders still carrying that tired slump. "Live far from town," she said, her tone almost questioning. "By choice," I replied. "Less trouble finds me out here." Her eyes held mine a moment longer, then drifted toward the window, where the fields stretched out into the distance. I couldn't tell what she saw out there, freedom, safety, or maybe something chasing close behind. She didn't offer more, and I didn't press her. The day carried on with its usual demands. Animals don't care about strangers or mysteries. They only care about feed and water. I tried to focus on the chores, but every sound from the house kept pulling my attention back. A floorboard creaking, a chair scraping it, was all new music to a place that had grown used to silence. By midday, She stepped out onto the porch, the quilt folded neatly over her arm. She stood there like she belonged, her bare feet brushing against the old boards, her eyes wandering across the land as though she was measuring its size. I brought her a cup of water and she took it with both hands, as if the weight of the tin cup meant something. She didn't drink right away, only held it while her gaze stayed on the horizon. "It's quiet here," she finally said. "It's meant to be," I replied, watching her closely. That was all she offered, and once again, silence filled the gaps. I thought of the barns I'd slept in as a boy when my father's temper got too sharp, the nights when I'd chosen the company of horses over the sound of shouting. Maybe she had her own reasons for seeking shelter in mine. As the hours passed, questions turned over in my mind. Where had she come from? Was someone looking for her? Was she running toward something, or away from it? She gave no hints, only small gestures that revealed nothing and everything at once. The way her hands lingered on the wood rail as though touching something steady grounded her. The way her eyes shifted at sudden sounds, quick but controlled, like someone used to being hunted. That evening, as the sun melted into the hills, I sat with her on the porch. I hadn't invited her, but she joined me anyway. Her presence as natural as the crickets starting up in the grass. We didn't speak much, just listened to the land settling into night. The air carried the faint smell of smoke from the stove, and for a rare moment, I didn't feel the weight of being alone. Yet under it all, tension hummed like a wire stretched too tight. The way she avoided certain questions, the way she seemed to know her way around barns and farms, yet never mentioned where she'd worked before. The way she looked out toward the road when the wind shifted, as if expecting someone or something to appear. When I finally turned in for the night, I expected her to return to the barn. That was where she belonged, after all. But when I rose again before dawn, the faint glow of the lantern showed me otherwise. She was still inside, not in the barn this time, but seated by the kitchen window, staring out at the darkness beyond. Her expression was unreadable, her fingers wrapped around the edge of the table. She didn't move when I entered, didn't even turn her head. "You've got a good stretch of land," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been thinking long before she spoke. "It's enough to keep me busy," I said, setting the coffee pot on the stove. Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw something there I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that told me she was holding back more than just her name. I wanted to ask. I wanted to demand answers to every question that had been circling since the night she arrived. But I didn't. Instead, I poured coffee, set a cup in front of her, and waited. She wrapped her hands around the mug, the steam rising between us. For a long while, she didn't drink, didn't speak. Then she said, "Trouble has a way of finding even the quietest places." The words hung in the room like smoke. I didn't know if she was warning me, or herself, or both. Either way, I knew then that her story hadn't begun with the storm it had started long before. And whatever road had led her to my barn wasn't done with her yet. And as the first light of morning crept across the fields, I understood something else too. Whatever trouble she carried, it was already tied to me now. The moment she stepped into my barn, my quiet life had shifted, and there was no telling where it might lead. The days that followed felt as if time itself had slowed, yet beneath the quiet there was a current of unease that never left. She stayed longer than any traveler had a right to, moving through my house as though testing the strength of its walls, its corners, its silences. I kept waiting for her to offer some truth about where she had come from or what had driven her into my barn that stormy night, but she gave none. Instead, she seemed to settle into the rhythm of the farm, her presence weaving into the daily work so naturally it unsettled me even more. She rose early, almost as early as I did, and went straight to the animals as if she'd known them all her life. The horses grew calm around her, the cattle shifted less when she walked the fences. There was a way she carried herself, practiced and steady, that told me she had known this life before. Yet when I asked where, her eyes always moved to the horizon, and the answer never came. At night, I sometimes caught her standing on the porch with her arms folded, watching the dirt road that wound past the farm. Her face was unreadable, but her stillness was sharp, like someone bracing for a sound or a figure to appear at any moment. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe she was just someone used to moving, unused to quiet land where only the wind and coyotes broke the dark. But deep down I knew better. Trouble has a way of showing itself in the small things first. One morning I rode out to check the north fence and found the wire cut clean, not worn or broken as it might be by weather or animal, but sliced sharp by a blade. I patched it without much thought at first, but later that day when I mentioned it offhand, I saw her shoulders tighten just slightly. Just kept her hands busy kneading the bread dough, but that small silence told me more than words. She knew something, or at least suspected. There were other signs, too. A rider had passed along the ridge one evening, too far off for me to make out his face, but close enough to know he wasn't out there by chance. He circled, watched, then disappeared into the trees. When I brought it up, she asked nothing of his appearance, only how long he stayed. That told me more than she intended. The farm became a place of waiting. Each sunrise felt like the opening of a chapter I hadn't agreed to read. Each sunset a reminder that whatever story she carried wasn't done with her yet. And through it all, I found myself torn between wanting her gone for the safety of my land and wanting her to stay for reasons I couldn't name. It wasn't just her mystery that pulled me in. There was something about the way she moved through the work, quiet but steady, or the way she sat at the table in the evening, her eyes tired but strong. She reminded me of someone who had endured more than she'd ever speak of. And though I didn't know her story, I could feel its weight pressing against the edges of my own. The neighbors began to notice too. Out here, news traveled quicker than wagons, and it didn't take long for word to spread that I had company. Old Tom at the trading post asked me about her with a sly smile, but when I gave no answer, his expression shifted to something more serious. "You keep an eye out," he said. "Strangers don't show up without reason." In town, I caught whispers. Folks speculating, wondering where she came from, whether she had people looking for her. A widow said she'd seen men asking questions down by the river road, describing a woman not unlike the one in my house. My gut tightened hearing that, though I gave no sign. Back home, I watched her more closely, searching for signs of the truth. One night as the fire burned low, I noticed the way her hand lingered near the scar on her wrist, half hidden by her sleeve. When I asked about it, she turned the question aside with a simple shake of her head. Another time, she startled at the sound of a rifle crack far off in the hills, though it was nothing more than hunters at work. She laughed it off when she saw me watching, but the laugh was thin, empty of humor. As the days stretched, I began to sense that her silence wasn't just about keeping her past hidden. It was about keeping me safe from it. Yet the longer she stayed, the clearer it became that danger wasn't far behind. One evening, just as the sun dipped and shadows pulled long across the fields, the dogs began barking at the edge of the yard. I stepped out with the lantern, and there on the road I saw two riders halted, watching the farm in the fading light. They didn't call out, didn't move closer, only sat there on their horses with a stillness that made the hair rise on my neck. When I returned inside, she was standing by the window, her face pale in the lamplight. She didn't ask who they were. She didn't need to. All she said was, "They found me." The words hung heavy between us, and in that moment, the quiet life I had built out here on the edge of nowhere cracked wide open. I didn't press her for details that night. I only sat by the fire, listening for sounds beyond the walls, and wondering what storm had truly come to rest on my land. In the days that followed, the riders didn't return, but the tension never lifted. She moved through the house differently now, more alert, as though expecting the door to burst open at any moment. At night, she barely slept, sitting often by the window with her shawl drawn tight. I didn't ask questions because I already knew that whatever truth lay behind her eyes, it was bound to bring me into it whether I wanted or not. And yet, even with the threat hovering, something kept me from sending her away. Maybe it was the simple fact that she had no place else to go. Maybe it was the way her presence filled a hollow I hadn't admitted was there. Maybe it was because somewhere deep down, I already knew her fight had become mine. But the farm was no longer just mine. Every sound carried weight, now the cry of a crow, the snap of a branch, the echo of hooves in the distance. Each small moment reminded me that the quiet life I'd chosen was slipping, and in its place was something darker, something I didn't yet understand. I didn't know if the men on the ridge would return, or if they were only scouts for something worse. I didn't know if her silence was meant to protect me, or to hide me from truths too heavy to bear. All I knew was that the days of living untouched by the world were gone, And as the sun dipped once again, painting the sky in fire, I realized that the real storm hadn't even begun. It was still out there, moving closer, waiting for its moment to break. The nights grew heavier, each one stretched thin, with the kind of silence that doesn't comfort but warns. She hardly slept anymore, and when she did, it was fitful, her body tense beneath the quilt, as though her mind never truly rested. I'd wake in the small hours to find her standing by the window again, her outline etched in moonlight, her eyes fixed on the road. I stopped asking what she was waiting for, because deep down I already knew. Trouble was coming, and it was only a matter of when. The farm felt different under that weight. Every sound was sharper, every shadow longer. The dogs barked at nothing more than wind through the trees, but still I reached for the rifle each time. The cattle grew restless too, their movements jittery as if they sensed the unease that seeped through the land. I tried to keep the rhythm of the days, tried to make the farm feel like itself, but no matter how many fences I mended or fields I worked, the tension hung there, unshaken. She worked alongside me, steady and quiet. Her hands knew their way around the chores, but her eyes were never far from the edges of the property. Sometimes I'd catch her flinch when the wind carried distant sounds, hooves, voices, the crack of a rifle far off. When I asked, she brushed it aside, but her silence spoke louder than her words. The truth was, she was waiting for them to come, and she believed they would. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I found her by the barn, mending a harness with fingers that moved quick, but shook faintly. I leaned against the doorframe and asked what I'd been holding back for too long. If you're expecting them, then I ought to know who they are. She didn't look up, just kept working, the thread pulling tight. They're men who don't let go, men who don't forgive. That's all you need to know. That's not enough, I said, sharper than I meant. Not if they're coming here. Her hands stilled. She looked at me then, and the weight in her eyes nearly knocked the wind out of me. I didn't mean to bring it to your door, she whispered. But once they've marked you, there's no outrunning it. There's no hiding. I waited for more, but she gave none. The words ended there, and the silence after them was colder than the night air. It wasn't long after that the riders came again. This time, they didn't linger at the ridge. They came closer, 3 of them, their shapes black against the twilight, their horses stirring dust on the road. They didn't speak, just sat there watching, the way men do when they want to remind you that your peace is only borrowed. I stood on the porch, rifle in hand, every muscle tight. She was beside me, her face pale, but set, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The riders turned back after a while, but I knew it wasn't over. They were measuring, testing, letting us know they could come closer anytime they chose. That night I barred the doors and kept the rifle across my knees, sleep nothing but a memory. She stayed near the fire, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes never leaving the shadows at the window. Days passed with no sign of them, but the quiet only made it worse. Anticipation stretched nerves thin. Each morning I walked the fence lines, checking for signs. Twice I found boot tracks near the creek, fresh and deliberate. Once I spotted smoke from a campfire just beyond the tree line. They were close. They were watching. She grew more restless, pacing the house when she thought I wasn't looking, her hands twisting together as though holding back words she couldn't bring herself to say. One night, when the wind howled through the rafters, she finally spoke. They don't just want me, they want what I know. I turned toward her. And what do you know? She shook her head. Enough to ruin them. Enough to make them chase me across every mile of this land. That's why they won't stop. Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear beneath it. Not the kind that weakens, but the kind that hardens into resolve. She wasn't running anymore. She was waiting. The farm became a trap then, though neither of us spoke it aloud. Every corner felt too open, every path too exposed. I took to moving tools into the barn that could serve as weapons, making sure the horses were ready to ride if needed. My life had been simple before, built on soil and sweat, but now it felt like a battlefield dressed in the skin of a farm. One afternoon, clouds rolled heavy across the sky, pressing low and dark. The air carried that stillness before a storm, the kind that makes the land hold its breath. She stood at the porch rail, her eyes fixed on the road, and said, "It'll be soon." I didn't ask how she knew. I just nodded because I felt it too. The land itself seemed to know. That night, the storm broke. Rain lashed the windows, Thunder cracked the sky, and through it all, I thought I heard more than the weather. Hooves pounding against the soaked earth, voices carried in snatches of wind. I stood at the window, rifle in hand, but saw nothing beyond the sheets of rain. Still, the feeling clung to me that they were out there, drawing closer under cover of the storm. When morning came, the rain had eased, but the evidence was clear. Tracks in the mud, fresh and deep, circling the edges of the property. They'd been there, close enough to touch the land, close enough to remind us that the walls of my house weren't walls at all. She said little, only tightened her shawl and went back to work with the horses. But I saw the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted to the tree line. She was bracing herself, and so was I. The days that followed dragged slow, each one heavier than the last. The tension was no longer just in her eyes or my chest, it was in the very air. The neighbors had stopped coming by. Word must have spread, or maybe they'd seen the riders themselves. Either way, it left us more alone than ever. Then came the evening that pushed everything to its edge. The sun was sinking, bleeding red across the fields, when the dogs began barking wild, their voices sharp and desperate. I stepped outside, and there they were 5 riders this time, not 3, spread wide across the road. Their faces were shadowed by hats, but their stillness spoke louder than any words. She came to stand beside me, her face drawn tight, her voice barely a whisper. It's them. I raised the rifle, my hands steady, though my heart pounded hard. The riders didn't move, didn't call out, just sat there watching as the last light drained from the sky. The weight of their presence pressed down like the storm before lightning strikes, and in that moment, I knew the quiet days were over. The standoff stretched long, the kind of silence that could snap at any second. I felt her hand brush against mine, not for comfort, but as if anchoring herself. Her eyes never left them, and I realized that whatever bound her to these men, it was deeper and darker than I had imagined. The air was thick, the land itself holding still. Every nerve in me screamed that the moment was coming, the one everything had been building toward. And as the last trace of sunlight vanished, one of the riders lifted his hand. And I knew the storm was about to break. The moment that rider's hand lifted, the whole world seemed to freeze. The dogs barked mad in the yard, the horses kicked at their stalls, and every nerve in my body braced for what I thought would be the end. But no shot came, not yet. The riders sat there in silence, 5 shadows against the fading light, their presence alone loud enough to shake the air. My rifle felt heavy in my hands, but it wasn't just the weight of wood and steel, it was the weight of choice. She stood beside me, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked on the men across the road. For the first time since she arrived, she looked less like a weary traveler and more like someone prepared for a reckoning. I realized then that whatever past she carried, it was about to crash straight into both of us. Finally, one of the riders spoke, his voice rough but clear. "You've run far enough." The words hit like a strike of lightning, sharp and final. She flinched, but only slightly, then stepped forward until she was standing at the edge of the porch. "I told you before," she said, steady and strong. "I won't go back." The man laughed, a low sound that didn't carry humor. "You think hiding in some farmer's bed changes anything?" I felt heat rise in me, anger mixing with fear, but I didn't speak. This wasn't my fight to start, though it had become mine all the same. I could see it plain, the truth that had been haunting her silence. These men weren't just chasing a runaway. They were chasing someone who had seen too much, someone who carried knowledge sharp enough to cut them down. She turned her head just enough to glance at me, her eyes holding a message I finally understood. She hadn't meant to bring this to my door, but she had no choice. And now neither did I. The standoff stretched long. Then, without warning, one of the riders spurred his horse forward, the others following close behind. The ground shook with their approach, and everything I'd feared was suddenly real. The rifle cracked in my hands before I even thought, the shot echoing across the land. It didn't strike a man, but it split the ground near their horses, a warning more than a kill. They pulled up short, the storm breaking into shouts and curses. She grabbed my arm, pulling me back inside. The door slammed, the latch thrown, the room lit by the fire's glow. "They won't stop," she said, breathless but certain. "Not until it's finished." The night that followed was a blur of sounds, hoofbeats circling, men calling to one another, the crack of branches as they tested the edges of the property. We didn't sleep, not even close. I kept the rifle close, she kept her shawl tight, and both of us sat waiting for the break that seemed certain to come. But by dawn, the riders were gone, leaving behind only tracks and silence. When the sun rose, she finally told me everything. Her voice was calm, but her hands shook as she spoke. She had worked for men who dealt in things they shouldn't, legal trades, stolen goods, secrets meant to stay buried. She hadn't planned to cross them, but she had seen too much. Papers, names, ledgers that proved what they were. She had taken nothing, but knowledge itself was enough to make her a danger. So she ran, night after night, town after town, until the storm brought her into my barn. Her story made sense of everything, the way she knew the land, the way she avoided questions, the way her eyes never left the horizon. She wasn't just running from fear. She was running from men who would do anything to silence her. I should have been angry, should have sent her away right then for bringing such danger onto my quiet life. But I wasn't. Instead, I felt a strange calm. Maybe it was the long nights of waiting, or the way she had stood firm even when the riders called her out. Maybe it was because, in all her running, she had chosen to stop here. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the way they used to be. We both knew the riders could return at any time. Still, something had shifted. She no longer looked like someone waiting for the world to end. She worked the farm beside me, steady and sure, her hands no longer trembling when they held the reins or the rope. I noticed the way the land seemed to welcome her, the animals calming under her care, the air itself settling in her presence. Word from town carried whispers of men searching nearby, asking questions that grew more desperate with each passing day. Folks avoided my land, unwilling to get caught in whatever storm lingered here. But for us, life went on in its own way. Fences still needed mending, fields still needed tending, and between the work we built a rhythm that felt almost like peace. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the sky turned gold, she sat beside me on the porch. The air was warm, the land quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something like contentment. She looked at me, her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them, and said, "I don't know how long this will last, but I'm tired of running." "You're not alone anymore," I told her. And I meant it. The conflict wasn't gone, not truly. Somewhere beyond the hills, those riders still circled, waiting for their chance. But inside those moments of calm, we found something worth holding on to. Something neither of us had expected when the storm first drove her into my barn. In time, the land itself seemed to claim her. The neighbors, though wary, began to accept her presence. She became part of the farm story, not just a stranger who stumbled in one night, and though danger still lingered, it no longer defined her. What defined her was the strength she carried, the way she had faced down the men who hunted her, and the quiet courage that had brought her to stand beside me. Looking back, I realized that her arrival had changed more than just my days of solitude. It had reminded me that life, no matter how carefully built, will always find a way to test you. Sometimes it comes in storms, sometimes in strangers, sometimes in the quiet choices we make without even knowing their weight. She had been a shadow at first, a mystery that unsettled the stillness of my farm. But in the end, she became something more, proof that even the heaviest burdens can be shared, and even the darkest nights can break into dawn. The riders never did return in force, though their presence lingered like a ghost in the corners of the land. Maybe they moved on, or maybe they decided the fight wasn't worth it. Either way, the story they brought with them ended here. Not with fear, but with a kind of peace that comes only after standing your ground. And so, the barn that once held only cattle and hay carried a new story, one I never expected. She slept there that first night, seeking nothing more than shelter from a storm. By morning, she was in my bed, and by the days that followed, she was in my life. That was how it ended. Not with a battle that tore the land apart, but with a quiet truth. Sometimes the storms that seem like the end are only the beginning. And sometimes the strangers who walk into your world are the ones who give it meaning. Would you like me to enrich this ending further with more reflection on the narrator's personal growth and lessons learned, so the takeaway feels even more powerful and lasting for readers?